Yeah. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining. I'll give a brief introduction what I'm going to talk about today. So it's a research mainly that then translated into a form of urban planning. I call it towards a new landscape because, you know, there's an urgency and need of a change of the contemporary that I always believed. And that is a constant push that I hope all of us can take forward. Without further ado, I will go through the presentation. First part is a little bit about history. You might know some of it about urban planning. The second part would be a little bit more about research. And finally, we will talk about one of the projects that we participated in and how that research translates to practical, or let's say close enough to kind of competitions, etc., and how we can get closer towards reality. It's been a long journey on this subject for me for about 15 years or so now. So I will take up questions at the end if you have any, and I'll start. Okay, so not sure the screen is changing.
No.
Okay.
Yes. Now, yes. Bit slowly, but yes.
So, so this is one of the projects that we'll talk about in the end, but let's start with the city. So our understanding of cities have been really old. This picture on the wall is a recently discovered dugout, which is about 3,400 years old. It's called the Golden City of Luxor, recently discovered this year earlier. And you can start seeing that, you know, even small cities, there were these, you know, Dieste kind of architecture evolving 3,400 years ago. But then it brings us to three questions, very critical one. Why cities? Why do we build cities? Why do people identify with cities? We meet people in a pub or a club and say, where are you from, where you come from, and what. So we want to try and identify people for where they come from, maybe gives us certain hints of what their personalities are. And which brings you into a deeper question is what is then, we say they're from a particular culture, what is then culture? And I think that is one of the biggest questions that we must answer. For me, I think culture is not something in the past. Culture is the present, because what we build today, you know, gets filtered. Whatever we design as a new object, a new thing, or a new city, would then become part of the growth model. And then, you know, if people think whatever we have done is good enough, then they preserve it. And therefore, 100, 200, 400 years line, if what we have done survives, then that becomes the culture of the place. So culture is not looking backwards, it's actually working towards. So with the realization of that, you know, whenever we dig out cities in the past, from Mohenjo-daro to Sumerian or Ur, you see that the sense of a master plan has been inevitable. People have been trying to do these different versions, different ideas, and then therefore that became the culture later on. And you know, you talk about Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, or you know, Antillonian towns, and so on. So bearing in mind that contemporary design plays a super important value in what will tomorrow become the culture. I think that's the fundamental of education as well, about cities and any other subject. But why do people move to cities? That's the bigger question. So they move to city because it has a higher energy state. It brings a lot of people together. And when a lot of people and ideas come together, they bring out new progressive development. Money, that's one of the motivations to move to a city if you're poorer. the city has a lot of money churning out. And then power, you're more likely to be ahead or governing systems from the city because you have more intelligence, more interactions, and social and career aspirations. But all these kind of words that are on the top lead to something what we call the frog effect, which basically, if I took a person and put them directly into this high energy state, they would burn. But if you slowly graduate into the city and the city starts to turn its tempo, it's usually not so much possible in when you move directly, but slowly and steadily you get used to the city, and the same boiling point does not seem that hot. So there are two movements that usually tend to happen, that either people move towards the city, as we talked about, which is the city drag movement, or they move to the city and they've made enough money and then they want to move out into the suburbs so that they get not too far from the city, but at least decent enough to get into the city in the right time. So this is a conflict that's not just of today. It's been, from Ebenezer Howard, who's been talking about this two different town and country, let's say. But he was also proposing at the time this idea of the town country. And the town country is trying to find that balance between the suburban lifestyle and the city, and the chaos of the city, where the rooms start getting smaller and living starts becoming more and more uncomfortable. And this is the town country, in the ideas of Ebenezer Howard, that's what we're going to look at in a little bit more finer detail, because we believe that most of the times whenever an attempt has been made, it either leads towards a town or towards a country, but never forms something an intermediate in its urban systems. And we look at the sister city structures as well. So moving forward, this is a constant conflict. As we know, what shaped our contemporary cities was a very big conflict at New York, happening in the early 80s, which was between Robert Moses, who was an ex-mayor and trying to push for this high-rise towers as the downtown New York as we know it, and Jane Jacobs, whose husband was an architect and she was a writer, and she was constantly fighting about the neighborhoods and the sustainability and the safety of these neighborhoods, etc. So you see this dichotomy between, or a juxtaposition between these two very fragmented ideas of, let's say, what we know as the town, revenue generating financial capital city, and what we know as a city as a people's place, fought by Jane Jacobs, etc. But when we start looking at, and this is a LSE report that we were part of, and mega cities that they were doing a research in LSE, and it went around the world, and I was part of the Mumbai one, and you realize that, in the city, you start looking at these high-rise, high-density areas, and then the rest of the city is pretty much low-rise. And then you look at London, and it seems predominantly low-rise, and you wonder why. And of course, this is changing now. But the city is usually unevenly distributed in its density. No matter where you are, you will notice this distribution problem. So moving further, at that time when we were doing the research in 2009, UN Habitat predicted there are about going to be 28 mega cities exceeding 8 million in population. Well, this is already over-exceeded. Cities like Delhi are 16 million plus, London, Greater London is more than 16 million plus, and so on. And Beijing is quite high as well. So, so when we look at that, we come to what have been the planning strategies of the past. So, of course, there is this kind of linear, let's say, distribution strategies, which is, let's say, Brasilia, or Navi Mumbai, which was one of the biggest planned cities in a contemporary 80s, and even, for example, in Saudi Arabia. So King Abdullah Economic Center is quite big, it's 1.1 million people. But you look at these cities and you realize that they don't really match up to 8 million. They're quite far from it. But our existing cities are 10 million plus. So there has never been a master plan for that kind of a scale. So moving forward, I would come back to this later, but moving forward, so we have the Harvard City Beautiful scheme diagram that is, replicated in Delhi, and somehow these three centers are also visible in parts of Paris, central areas of Paris, but there is a density, and you'd see that the Paris density is quite dense because it's a low-rise, high-density fabric, and other places it tends to be a lot less. Second stage of a growth model was linear, which was developed by the train tracks or the road systems. So even like Brasilia or New York, they're basically train track-based systems. So the deployment happens as the train goes through these places, and the further you go away from the city, the jobs remain in the downtown, Manhattan, and so on, and you have to come and visit the city and go back. So a lot of life times is spent traveling, and I lived in one of those. But then the third grid strategy has been the grid, and this is the very common strategy in let's say the traditional developments to even Chandigarh and Mexico City. But you look at, I think the critical point to look at is the densities, about 8,000, 6,000, and Paris was about 21,000. So it's a very critical understanding of why low-rise high density can give you higher density in an overall spectrum. However, the grid also has its problems. The connectivity has always remained a problem for the grid. And the other strategies that were used in contemporary city, or are used in contemporary cities, which is based on public transport, creates an unequal balance of land. So whenever the nodes are placed, the developers rush in and you get higher densities along the metro corridors or along the main roads. And then therefore the city again remains low density in other parts and not equally distributed. So what are the drawbacks is that firstly, you need, in this kind of design strategy, you need very high investment costs from the government. So you would now see that only big governments can invest into this kind of high investment infrastructure first. And then you need a very strong authoritative direction to do these implementations, otherwise it doesn't work. And so what happens, so now moving on to a little bit of this, what was happening when I came to London and this city research was being done, there was lots of work at Zaha and AA and other places where people were talking about this diagonal. So you break away the grid and you create this diagonal. So there was a lot of talk about it. There was a lot of debate, and there were things like, what planet are they on and what are they talking about, crazy. But then the thing changed slowly, gradually into the field. So you realize that as computational design came in, we could control larger fields with very parameters that design or were part of the city. But there was a lot of research being done at the DRL, which was the research lab, which led on to some of the master plans, which was in Singapore that was built, which is the One North master plan, or something more today, let's say what we are doing in the office, which is Tallinn. But you can see the translation of how that One North is now translating into something like an urban planning. But as you can see that these are very local scales. So you don't talk about the city. The scale is confined to, let's say, development and so on. So you do not have control of the infrastructure, which is basically done at the government levels. So therefore, this is one of the projects that I had shown once before as well, but it's a good project to show because the modules are split up into smaller blocks that are more sizable. And because it's next to a port, it has all this port systems, and then let's say the land use and the green area distributions that tell you about the city. But you can start to see that, okay, this was a site here, but lots of places around, you will start to see the density of green distribution on the right is very different from the one on the left, and so on and so forth. Of course, there are reasons, but it tends to be very unevenly distributed. And that is because chunks of land are always developed separately. Moving forward, there's another project that's currently, or we are doing in China, which is in, it's not Tallinn, it's It's in, that's a wrong, it's in Hangzhou. And there are multiple others that is being developed at the moment in the office, and they are really high-rise, high-density modules. But that is only because these are specific land chunks that are given to developers to develop. So the government takes the responsibility of the infrastructure, which is high investment, and the lands are then given to the developers for public-private partnership kind of logic. But where does this come from? Where have we come to in terms of city planning with this kind of approach? We have come to we've come to what we're calling is a self-organizing behavior. So we do not, governments across the world seem to think that we do not need to plan an overall city, whereas we can let small areas develop and then on their own, which is loosely based on complexity theories. And the consequences of these are high economic and heavy investments. Medium economy means heavy investments, and even lower economy needs heavy investments because the social housing is then responsible for the developers. So, and the nodes then are left to self-organize independently. So this is the change that I was talking about to you in London, and this is what I call the current scenario is a Primark urbanism. So it's like a used and disposed city. You build today and you can build it, bring it down and build it again. And it's kind of this Primark, which is like cheap products that can be reused again and again, and which is very highly unsustainable in the long run. And you can already start seeing that these buildings are so close to each other. Like you can see here that, you know, the views, you can't even look out anymore. And because they're not, that some of them, there are people living in it, some of them are not, but you can start to see that this distribution of density is highly unsustainable already. And of course, there's this other aspect, which I always talk about, is this of ghost towns, because these properties are so expensive that they're beyond the reach of common people or even higher middle class, that they can't afford these houses. So they have to rent a lot or get into high debts with the banks. That is the only way you can buy in these properties in the city. Also, there are other aspects. This is a photograph I took when I went to Beijing many years ago, the idea of pollution and smog that's infiltrating most cities in the world, which is a consequence of very highly densified traffic systems and road networks. And we'll come to that. So this was the conclusion that we talked about, that most cities are designed in the 19th century, on the 20th century, with Chandigarh, Brasilia being maximum of 2.6 million people. And today's cities exist more, are more. So what are the strategies that we can develop that can cater to 16 million people and above? So we looked at one of the organic growth models of the city, which, how did London get its distribution of density so low? So if you look at London metropolitan region, so initially, London was a very small town, which was Londonian, which was only 1 square mile. But as soon as, you know, what made it a very interesting system is that in the Anglo-Saxon or the medieval time, a lot of small polycenters started growing around London. This was not planned, but this is how it developed. And these polycenters, even the name still today, still exist. And if you ever visit, you will see that these names continue. And then they formed these road networks, which are not that, you know, orthogonal and so on, because they were developed, because they were moving away from the city through these town centers into the next one. And therefore, you land up with a road system, which is very organic, of course. Obviously, it was based on local needs. But what you land up is a very equal distribution of density in a period of a long time, depending on as the town centers or the centers were growing, they started to develop, and so on and so forth. So we said, is there an alternative? And this is where the point of research started. And next, I would go into the research a little bit. So what we really learned from this is the density of roads. So if you look at London, the density of the black is the minor roads and the light gray is the major roads. The density of major roads did not increase. It actually was smaller, always been smaller compared to the minor roads. So the minor roads are, if not equally, but more important than the major roads. So we looked at different systems in nature. What are the different systems in nature that we do it? The current system that we have is a 60-meter road to 40-meter road and so on, which is the L system, which is like a branching of a tree. But the tree can only crater to itself, but not as a forest. A forest doesn't branch, the forest develops. And I would say till 2 million people, you're talking about a tree. When you go to 16, 20 million people, we're talking about a forest. And we should understand this difference and these two different approaches. So the other thing, which I call as the mesh versus the grid, but I mean, people have argued with me sometimes when I give this lecture that the mesh is also a grid, but not so orthogonal, not so rigid, but flexible. So it gives you opportunities of icons. As you can see in the target destination of the road is not another intersection, but is actually an icon, which makes a city recognizable. The second thing is the addition of another node. So every time we want to add more to a city in an L system on the left, every time you add a house on the end of the road, you have to widen the main street. Whereas on the right-hand side, when you have a mesh-defined logic, you can add another node, and that becomes another means to go around the city. The third thing we talk about is the efficiency of transport. Because of this, you would see that the cities that are organically developed or even more close and which do not have higher hierarchy of roads tend to be more efficient in terms of transport systems as well, and also in terms of usage of petroleum. And this is a very interesting experiment by Fry Otto, which is called the wool thread experiment. Basically, if you take a lot of these wool threads and you dip it into soap water, you get the most efficient system is not in a straight line on the right, but it's a convoluted mesh, but it is the most efficient. That's how the threads kind of join together and create the spaces. So it was quite interesting for us, but then you realize that if you look deeper into bone structures or any kind of natural systems, they are not straight lines, they are into these complex organizations. And these complex organizations are not, let's say, are not accidental, but they're dependent on the functions of each individual system. But they start to look very similar, from bone structure to organization of blood cells and so on. And even something like looking at, and they emerge because of these bottom-up systems, these local rules that can keep schools of fishes, which are about 1 square cubic meter, can have 1 million small fishes or birds flocking together. They don't have a higher intelligence, but the intelligence is at the lower level, and that's how they organize. So we wanted to look at if cities can do it. And we started at the point when we were looking at DLA systems initially to graduate from, and we were doing a lot of, including at one point in Suzhou, we did workshops on this with students on how to grow these modules. But then we are also talking about starting points and cultures and businesses that can influence these, let's say, distributions. And of course, we're talking about testing. I mean, we do repetition of tests and the fitness criteria. What would make these systems work? And what are the selective designations that make it the most efficient at the local level? So we do deployment strategies. And as you can see, these are all very point-based systems. They are not linear line-based systems. So these point-based systems give us controllability, let's say intersections. So we talk about intersection, we talk about distance of each module, and so on and so forth, which we're ready to control in a very highly complex manner. But at the same time, we also get to control the intersections of how we generate them based on the nodes that are around it. So from the point-based system, we create these nodes that are around it. And then we look at, let's say, the distribution. So traditional land use distribution has been, retail on one side, schools on one side, and so on and so forth. And then we looked at a broader spectrum of study of most cities around the world and how the land use is distributed in that grid module in a square mile or square 2 kilometers. And then we generate a system which is completely different from the one on the right that you see in Chandigarh. Because in Chandigarh, you can clearly see someone is, because of the tools available at the time, there would be Corbusier's hand, which would kind of decide which grid would have what kind of land use. But we have this system where we can play with the mix of the use, not just in plan, but also in the sectional dimension. So you can control the ground floor is retail and the top floor is residential to bring that mixed use. So it's a highly more complex system, which is adaptive. So brings me to CS Holdings, where what is sustainability at the end of the day? It's the capacity to create, test, and maintain adaptive capability. It's not doing sustainable in one go, but as long as you're adaptive, you will be sustainable in the long run. And therefore, we try and approach a low investment adaptive master plan. Moving on to what are the typical grid sizes, you realize that the most successful ones are about 100 to 200 grid sizes, and where Chandigarh is a little bit off scale, and that explains its problems with pedestrianization. Then we talk about Carlos Morena's 15-minute city, which was completely being deployed during the lockdown and the pandemic in Paris by the mayor. She thought it was a good idea, and they wanted to deploy this. And overnight, you see the changes are happening in London as well. You're getting more cycle routes and so on. But for organic cities to adopt this is very easy. But for cities that haven't had the generation pattern, which had been car predominantly distributed like America, it becomes very hard to adapt this module, where work, life, and home can be within a 15-minute radius. So the problems we are starting to see is evident. This is one of the research that I was doing with Charles Correa at the time, and we were doing the idea of what, in terms of housing, how much high does it make sense? So you realize that if you're in a luxury unit, if you go beyond, let's say, 20 stories, 20 number of floors, you don't save so much on a city level per person because you need to provide amenities, schools, etc. And in a low income group, at that time it was 25 square meters. I mean, this may vary, but you realize going about 5 stories does not make sense for a city. So saying that, we did some research on housing as well. We started to find out different typologies and how these different typologies are placed across the areas, the slab housing, the low-rise housing. And we studied also the comparison from for an incremental housing system that a lot of people have been talking about, from John Hebraken and in Peru, they had in the 60s, they had a lot of tests. So you try and compare how this works with the rest of the slab housing and the high-rise modules. And there are a lot of data that I would not go into, but you realize what comes inevitably as the intervention is the scale of the roads and how you can subdivide the scale of the roads in smaller sections, which you can see on the right. This is a housing by Peter Barber, which is in between 2 slab housings on the right-hand side and the left-hand side. And the intervention in the middle can make the streetscape into better. So I think we are also working on how, let's say, American cities or cities that have already been designed on high density of roads can also be converted into low-rise, high-density cities as well. So, and we have tried some different incremental housing modules, which benefits from diagonal, this visual diagonal axis that gives you forms that can be adaptive and in different shapes and sizes. So at the end of the day, what we're talking about, the development of the is a generic network with some distribution of roads. With, let's say, it's a city and the node starts to develop in time. And as the time grows, you have different functions, like, you know, so you need higher organizations, let's say a smaller government, and so on and so forth. And then the corridors of retail are allowed to expose. So it's not planned in advance, but it is a time-based module. So the planning happens, but the systems are already there in place, and it can start growing. And then the roads start being identified once it's grown, because of its adaptive capabilities. So we're talking about what these centers could be distributed as polycenters across the world. Okay, it was all good, but it was theory, but we needed to test it. So one of the things that we wanted to test was we participated in 2020 in a master plan in Lishui. And this was one of the images. This was the center of Lishui. As you can see, the center of Lishui is the open center, and which has a few cultural venues and mostly open to public. And we collaborated with, I mean, we were the lead members, and Space Syntax, who are very, you know, well known for city development, they were our partners. And we won a prize for the concept. But let me explain the city a little bit more. The city of Lishui is fragmentally developed in different parts. They wanted to combine 154 square kilometers, so which would have been one of the largest interventions in contemporary, let's say, world. And of course, they had cultural domains in Lishui. But we started to look at some of the systems of the slime mold. And as you can see, it all starts to relate back to the mesh system and what could be the new center of Lishui, and how the existing can connect and the proposed can connect, and so on. So there were some that were proposed already by the city authority, which are in pink. There were the new center, and the gray ones are the existing ones. So moving from there, we identified them, and we said, we are going to develop these polycenters all across Lishui. So we identified the main center as 10, and then small little centers around it. So we won't plan anything in between, and we would let it grow. So this was one of the diagrams we created for the polycenters to show it's a mixed development. But the city also contains a lot of layers, from the existing one to the green necklace, which is a full out connectivity with bicycles and pedestrians throughout the 50 kilometers that we have on the stride that's coast, that's neighboring the river, and then the distribution system and the nodes and the centers. And of course, there is land use, but the land use is very mixed. So it's not as clear as you would see in Chandigarh, but it's very, let's say, complex and very hard to understand. It's such a large plan, but if you go into the zoom in details, you will see. But also there is this connectivity across the existing cities that we had to cater to. But what does it give us? What does it give us by doing this and breaking away from the grid? So this was quite interesting for us when we did the space syntax analysis together with them, is that the multiplicity of nodes, as you can see on the bottom, the nodes are all very different. They are not orthogonal, and they create these different varieties that brings out a lot of different, let's say, high important areas. So the city no longer has this one center. It has the opportunities for many centers, and we don't predict which one is going to be. It's all dependent on whoever or whichever center is developing further. So obviously we did a metro master plan, which is, let's say, the fast transport, which is the BRT or the MRT. And then we did the smaller scale, which is also the roads and the tram, the cars and the trams, and also the cycle and the pedestrian, as we talked about. So this is the residential growth that happens first in stages, then the retail organizations follow it, and then more and more, as we said, the administration follow, and so on. This is one of the examples of the green necklace that ties the whole site together and how it works. And this is the phasing of development and the cost and so on that would be calculated based on that. And as I said, our systems was based on nodes, not roads. So you can see the hierarchy of nodes and the cross section. So the same 16-meter cross section can change with time, depending on the need. So from a pedestrian street, it can upgrade itself to a semi-tram street, to a car-based street, depending on how popular that node is getting. And where does it bring us in the long spectrum across the world in terms of cities? So this is the development of the total, and we reach an efficiency of 20%, which is very close to what Paris gives us, or London, and so forth. So it's intense capability, and this is some of the, let's say, the investment opportunities that we had to develop, which says that you know, people can buy individual units, builders can buy collaborative units, and large-scale developers can buy a larger chunk of units. So it is available for all in that sense that we were trying to promote. And these are some of the visualizations of the street sections, let's say, and also, let's say, the color distribution of, let's say, the local level of what the street furnitures would have. This is one of the renders into the Silicon Valley. This is, let's say, one of the hubs, which is the museum. This is a bit on the wetland tourism that was there. I won't go much into detail. So they needed some preservation areas with some tourism. And now it brings me to the last part. This was all good as well as tested. What is the next steps ahead? And that, to me, is the steps that which Einstein talks about, that computers are incredibly fast, accurate, but stupid, and humans are incredibly slow, inaccurate, but brilliant. But together they form a very powerful imagination. And what has happened today is, this is one of the Getty images, is that the idea of the land banks. So cities have become places for holding assets. So, and I was giving a lecture in Washington about 8 years ago on cities, and someone asked me that, and I was at the time thinking that this is not possible, that whatever we are implementing before low-rise high density, and they said, one of the students asked me that, why are you being so pessimistic about it, that it can't be done in your lifetime? And I think recently there has been a way I feel that this would break. And for me, that is coming very quickly into the market, that land banks would change and investments would move to a different territory, which is a digital territory. I know that cryptocurrency has its problems with mining and sustainability and so on and so forth. But for me, this is one of the things that would free our cities to get back into the town country that Harvard was talking about, the low-rise high density that I've been trying to argue for 10, 20 years. And why I think so is because this is a map of all the cities in the world that we could dig out. And you can see that all the world land areas are mostly used already. So we don't have much opportunities left to populate unless we kill all the rainforests. And this is one of the diagrams we developed with my team is the connectivity of all these existing cities with high-speed rail, which seems to be already in progress in many different parts of the world, in Europe and China, and you can see that it's building already. And of course, there's going to be other modes of transport which are quicker, which is air, that will remain. All of this is supposed to be compiled in a book, but it keeps getting delayed, as you can see, from 2012. It's just been postponing because there's new thoughts that are coming in. So thanks for watching, but I think the future of cities are going to get brighter. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you very much, and nice to see the last slides where also you are procrastinating books. So we are not alone in academia procrastinating things. I remember you had this plan about the book. So thank you very much for your presentation. I was thinking about one of the latest slides you showed with the high-speed rail connections.
Mm-hmm.
it's a bit slow, the PowerPoint. So when you're clicking, it takes 3-4 seconds. So yes, this one. Now it's pretty interesting because the three images here, China, USA, and Europe, assume for 1 second that Europe is only one country. So all the maps are discussing high-speed rails within the country. Well, this morning I was reading an article, I have it here on my phone, about a connection between Guangzhou and Odessa. So from China, Guangzhou to Ukraine, which is a bigger scale. And this is politically interesting, but also fascinating from the infrastructural point of view, because basically it's connecting two places which are definitely far to connect. So the scale of the world is definitely changing. I would like to ask you to say a bit more about your take, since it's a personal interest, on not just on Bitcoin, which is one application, since you mentioned in one slide, and I see Gisela smiling, which is one application actually that runs on the blockchain. But more in general, if you see this technology having an impact on either architecture or city, because there are discussions on IoT level as well as of bigger level, decentralization and so on.
Yeah, I don't, so the last word, decentralization, I don't think is going to happen. But the question is, because you can see that already Bank of China has released that they're going to launch their own cryptos. And so is the Lloyds as well, and so on. So the banks which are existing will move into this direction. Mm-hmm. And yes, I strongly believe this taking away what I call the land banks, which has been the case on the left. As you can see, these high-rise towers, these residential apartments, the idea of ghost towns are a resultant of people have nowhere else to store their wealth other than buying property in big cities. And therefore, people are forced to move out of the city. So I think if we release that pressure, economic pressure on the land of the city, mm-hmm. I mean, what is a high-rise tower at the end of the day? It's a high economic pressure on a small piece of land. And that's the resultant as a tower, so you get more footprint usage. So if, and for me, I know there was problems with these currencies in terms of sustainability, in terms of mining, but there are smarter ones like ADA Cardano, which are improvising these or moving ahead with these systems. And I think this is a very early stage. And I believe it is like, you know, looking in the 90s when I was growing up and seeing computers for the first time, that we thought, oh, is this going to last? Or, you know, we couldn't imagine if this is going to be a day-to-day home thing that we are all going to be one day dependent on in the pandemic and still run so very well, or whatever we are doing, teaching or working, etc. So if there is any proof, I would say that it is the near future, that I am hopeful that cities will be released of this burden that has been holding in, or which was the slide I showed between the dichotomy between Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs, that maybe the idea of Robert Moses can finally be taken out of the cities, the idea that cities must be the economic holding capital of the world and be that powerful. So yes, I believe strongly that yes, it is a future. That's what my take is at the moment. It might change like it was, but currently I think it is a big progress.
Yeah, I agree with you, and it will change in any case, because this is just the first stage, so it will not stay as is. And that's also the other interesting thing, to see how a system that was created to overcome centralized national authority somehow is now getting, I don't want to say bought, but applied, as you said, not just by China, but all the other nations and banks like Lloyds who are looking into the technology because they can see the benefit. just a note on decentralization, and since Bitcoin comes always into the discussion, and then we have a question from CD that I will read. Let's note that, as the Ethereum founder said, Bitcoin is the first decentralized real project because of its nature. So it's somehow already there. There is a question from City, which can also unmute herself, actually, if she wants, and ask live.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
I'm not sure if this thing has been discussed, but my question is, would the expansion of digital currency correlating to the need of space to house the mining farms be integrated to public space in the future with the proliferation of data? What are the speculations, or are there any speculations on this? Since we are heading into that direction anyway. I mean, I don't see this happening in the near future, but maybe later on, this might be an issue, I would assume. Thank you.
Yes, I think the mining has been the biggest question on these digital currencies, because Bitcoin, which was the trigger or the starting point, or which is still used and it's becoming to be a currency, has huge mining issues. But I believe there are new coins, and I would encourage you to look into ADA Cardano, which reduces the mining. So, okay, just so everyone who are observing, so the way Bitcoin works is that for every transaction, it tracks all the other transactions that have taken place to guarantee that transaction. So, which means there's a lot of computation needed for one process of transaction, which is quite ridiculous, to be honest. I mean, we don't go to a bank and pay $10 and everyone else in the world needs to, support that. You can have smaller and smaller teams or groups that can guarantee you, which is something that ADA is coming to the market, or there are a few others. And I'm sure yuan and all these currencies would come into it. So I don't think mining as an architecture needs to be integrated, because I don't see mining as being the big usage of space, because they are going to cut it down. Because if they don't cut it down, this system won't work. So I would say they will cut it down. And so I don't believe that integration of mining and all. So it's like data servers, you see. Data servers are there, which are large, like Amazon, who we know. They have huge data servers, and they are already using large parcels of land. But do we live in Amazon warehouses or close to them? No, because it's not a place for us with the machines. So I think the huge amount of improvement is needed, and I'm sure all these guys who are competing to be the next Bitcoin are looking into this at much more than I am aware of. So yeah, I would say I can't see them integrating together with cities. They're always going to be away, because, and if they do integrate, it would be another colossal, because then you're again losing space for the people. That is my primary agenda. And because cities are such fabulous places where you meet people from all different cultures and varieties, that you need the maximum utilization of spaces for them. So yeah, that's my answer. I hope I answered your question, but that's what I think so far.
So before going to Lisa, because I see she has a question, for those who are maybe slightly less aware, there are a lot of studies on the environmental impact of Bitcoin mining. Someone has calculated like it has the same impact of the entire emission of Argentina or Turkey. There are a few states that get used as an example. And also, for instance, in China at the moment, it's not possible to do so because of energy production in Inner Mongolia. So there is a new policy in place, as well as in other countries. And of course, on the other way around, places like close to the North Pole, like Iceland, are places where this activity happens, because easy to produce energy as well as to cool down the servers that Subhati was mentioning. Gisela.
Two questions for you, Subhati. First of all, thank you for the presentation and the thought-provoking impulses. So following up from what Siti said, it still requires a building to house it and a system. If we deny a new building typology for the cryptocurrency, for the mining, then it will become an engineering building, but it will exist somehow. And this new building typology, but if you see that like a couple of 100 years ago, it used to be the cathedrals and the palaces that were the most expensive architectural icons. Now, in the last couple of years, it is insurances, government, and banks. So if it shifts now to cryptocurrency, it will be mining and whatever is funded through the money that the people own the farm actually do with it. So it will create some sort of form of new building typology. Would you say that goes to engineering rather than architecture?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, to be honest, I don't have a clear answer, but what we can know so far about, let's say, you know, all the messages that we send, WeChat, WhatsApp, and whatever we use, they're all stored somewhere. You know, it doesn't just evaporate. You know, governments store them, everybody stores them, and these are stored in data houses. Now, would we consider data houses equivalent to chapels? I don't think so, because chapels and churches were built with an idea of organizing people. There was some level of people organization needed for religion to survive. Whereas data centers don't need people organization within it. People could be thousands of miles apart, and data centers could be miles apart, and there is this, and it can work. I mean, I could say that it could even work if these data centers were under the sea, in some way, if you could manage it and free more land. So
and you could also say that money becomes the new belief system. At the moment, it is. People don't believe in a religion, but they believe in money.
Yes, because money is the religion at the moment. I mean, you don't trust people on anything else but currency.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the society, I think, works a lot on trust. And you know, money is there as transaction, but if you want to make that transaction, you need individual trusting individuals, and that's what I mean. There are companies and companies and lawsuits and lawsuits, but ultimately you come down to that face to face, two people trusting one another to invest all that money and so on and so forth. So I believe strongly that our social we must not undervalue or think that money is greater than our social trust in each other. It's not, because without that social trust, the transaction would never happen. And that is why cities become so important, that it allows you to meet these new people and gain that social trust.
Okay, then my second question, which follows up exactly on what you just said, which is actually pandemic impact on cities where you cannot maybe meet or freely collaborate. I mean, we're in China, we can at least meet within China, but we build a virtual wall around China equal to the previous Chinese wall, not to allow the invasion of the virus in. So it acts like a barrier, and it will last for a certain amount of time before it actually has major impact on individuals as well as on the economics. So what is the impact long-term in planning and, let's say, your mesh system and the cluster system of a city development? How would it be impacted by the pandemic?
I think in the short term, not so much, and in the long term, not so much, because it's a matter of scale. And for me, cities have always been a matter of scale, and I keep arguing that we got the scale wrong in the 60s. And that has been and that has been predominantly because a lot of influential car industries in America were forcing a direction of certain kind of urban planning. So when we apply it to the mesh system, which offers you in this diagram a 16-meter road, and there's a reason why it's 16 meters and not less or more, is the adaptability and the visual communication distances required in cities for it to be less anonymous. Yeah. So if I'm on a 40-meter road, on the other side, I don't care who it is because I can't see, I can't know. Whereas in a smaller scale, in a 16-meter, I start to recognize faces. So it has got to do with human anatomy as well. And that is where familiarity starts. So if you see a person walking down the same road as you are on the opposite side more in a week and so on. So that is what the mesh system tries to offer. The other thing that it does offer is this idea of, if I go back to the principal research of it, ideas of that you don't need to add, I think it's somewhere here, that we don't need to add another extra burden onto the main road, but I missed it.
Yeah, but it also means that somebody sneezes across the road or comes towards me coughing, that I'll actually completely freak out and try and get onto the other side.
Yes, but
so there's a weakness in the system as well, and then also the majority isn't like that of the cities.
Pandemic is a. I mean, we are all influenced by it at the moment, I know, but just bear in mind that it has also happened before. The Spanish flu, etc., and it disappears from the society once. And you can already start seeing, at least here in London, you can start seeing that, it was only a year ago, the pandemic, and as soon as things opened up, everyone's back to their normal, back to the parties, back to everything else, because people need that, interaction and need that collaboration. And so this is one of the critical sides, as I was saying, that if you add an extra house on the end, here, all the cars have to go through the main road, and therefore the road needs to keep getting wider and wider in time. Whereas in a mesh system, if we add one more point, from going from A to D, we have another way to reach that point every time we add a point. And that gives us the time-based flexibility, as well as not to having the burden to increase the road widths in the long term. But of course, as you start seeing in one of the diagrams, when we actually applied it to the practical solution, which was Li Shui, let me go there, that there was somehow, we had to, I think it was somewhere here. Yeah, this one, that because of the existing system in there, which you can see is a very large scale grid system on this side, and that's grid system already placed here, a grid system placed here, there, which is the main center, that we had to somehow address these main roads. But coming into our site, we had to make sure that we have enough roads to, because these are high moving traffics, and and one of the comments from Space Syntax was that we've been doing master plan for years, is that we need high speed traffic. And I find it very hard for people that cannot imagine high-speed traffic doesn't mean cars. It could be anything underground. It could be anything hovering over ground. It could be these flying cars that are being talked about by these drone systems. It could be anything. And that can free off this system. But what it comes down to, in my opinion, is that scale. And that scale must be maintained on the street levels. That's hopefully I've answered your question.
Of course you did, but we don't need to always agree as well. Because I think it's one thing is a theoretical model, and another thing is overlaying it and actually making it work with the system. But I leave some space for the students or other colleagues to ask as well. Thank you, Subhati. Much appreciated.
Richard?
I have a question to you, Subhati.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your engaging presentation and studies. And I have a question kind of related to the image of the London street that you showed, St. Paul's, and then your mesh system, which I do quite like it. But I'm wondering how flexible is the mesh to allow for those kind of occurrences where you would have these very large volumes from an era past, and would your mesh allow for such kind of volumes to be integrated into it? You know, whether it would be for archaic reasons or for sporting reasons or whatever. That's the first question. And then the second question is, the mesh has a kind of beauty about it, but it kind of, there's a sense of detail which is removed, and I know that it's only a study, but detail gives people a sense of place and positioning within the urban fabric, kind of what Gisela was saying, and you were also saying, you know, if you see somebody, you can actually recognize or see somebody sneezing across the other side of the street because of their proximity, or there's familiarity because of the identity. How would you handle that? Or is it something which you think would evolve?
Richard, I couldn't understand your second question. You're saying, I understood your first question. The second question, can you just summarize it?
Yeah, the summary of the second question is detail. Detail kind of makes, builds up a pattern within us, you know, a sense of familiarity, identity of the street, and how could you establish that? You know, how would you counter the fact that people are walking and looking at their phones at the same time? How would you take the eye from the phone to the street, for example?
I think both the questions are very interrelated in some way to the organization. And so the one on the bottom left, when you get this icon, you know, Christopher Wren did about, if I'm not wrong, 45 churches across the city of London. And all these top churches, you know, we give credit to Christopher Wren for building them, but what we don't give credit to the organization of the streets of the London that made it possible for him to identify these locations, because these locations were in the middle of the street, most of them, because the streets don't go 90 degrees like in New York. So you don't get the location. So even if you had the most beautiful building in New York, you wouldn't get an appreciation place for it other than when you're in front of it. So the mesh system tries to, you know, as you can see on the top, this is one of our diagrams that I don't know, David, can I mark on this? No.
I can grant you, give me, let me see.
Okay, but you can see my mouse, right? So if I'm walking down this road, you know, or I'm coming down that road, you get a potentiality of an icon in there in the center. If I'm walking down this road, you get a potential of an icon over there, and so on and so forth. Sometimes you don't, but here you do, and so on. So the one of our main, and which I agree with you, is one of the main things is to firstly provide that opportunity, and then you hope that someone or some urban designer in the city would take that opportunity and say that, oh, you know, every time we are meeting these focus points, we should create something. And that obviously is, we can't put it into the rule system. I mean, there could be guidelines that say that, okay, if you're meeting at the corners, or if you're kind of approaching a corner, that corner building has to be something iconic, could be a school or hospital, I don't know, but it has to be something recognizable which then gives you the memory of a city. So you identify the city based on these memories, which then becomes culture, which was my starting point in the beginning of the lecture. So yes, the mesh does provide it, and that was one of our main reasons why we move away from the grid, although a lot of people say that the grid is also a mesh, but yes and no. Yes, it looks like one, but it doesn't deliver as one. The second question, I think, is about the phone and the interaction and the detail. So I think as urban planners, we can provide the opportunity. You know, sometimes I've seen some people screaming at the other person because they're looking at the phone and they don't know where they're going and they're just about to crash on the other person. But, but that will happen only when space is organized in certain way and the footpaths are not 15 meters wide or 20 meters wide, but 3 meters wide.
One of the things when you walk around London, particularly the older parts, and they've maintained, you know, some of these sort of really nice old shops, which are too expensive to walk into, but still really nice. You know, like around Store Street, for example, these beautiful streets. They're not very wide. In fact, you know, they're probably about a third of the width of your mesh. In fact, a quarter of your width of your mesh street. But they have a sense of character about them, which is, and I don't mean to sort of like be cheesy, but they're timeless. You know, these sort of really narrow streets, which still have occupancy on both sides at low level and high level. I guess what I'm sort of just hinting at is that could the mesh go further? You know, could it actually be even more constricted at points where maybe you don't allow vehicles to go down? You know,
absolutely, absolutely. I think it has a lot of potential, and this brings us to one of these slides where we were testing the intersections and what is the possibilities of different intersections, how they merge, which is a further, I mean, I think you're talking about this lower resolution scale within that. We had looked at it and what should be the size of it. And so it's a lot of work in progress. So, I mean, I think parts of it I haven't included in a finer detail or giving exact numbers because we are not allowed to because of the research. But yeah, I think there are opportunities for cul-de-sacs, for example, let's say, which is very popular in something like Paris, where you come into this courtyard and then that's it, you know, and you have everything nice around it, and the main street is far away. But also something like this, I think, is very critical, which changes from the traditional urban planning, is that this idea of marking zones with a sketch pen, let's call it, and coloring a plan in different colors to say this is residential, this is commercial, forgetting that we have a mixed use developments where commercial is at the bottom, residential is at the top, could be offices together with it, or offices in the middle and residential at the top. It could be mixed uses. And how do we take that into a city level planning? So that's where something like this, when we have these graphs to control it, not just in plan level, but in the 3-dimensionality and the sectional level of it. I think that it's still work in progress, this thing, but I think that gives us a really highly complex system within a city. So yeah, and I think, and which allows us to then say that ground floor in certain areas are commercial, but not, and they are probably below the office, and then maybe they're residential up top. And so the 24-hour usage of space is maintained. But even cities like London, you know, Canary Wharf, for example, is really dead at night. The city centers, you know, I mean, if you go to Mumbai, the downtown Manhattan is different from downtown Mumbai, because downtown Mumbai, people leave the city in the night, and because it's only majorly offices and banks, it remains unused. So spend so much of street furniture and everything, and it's unused in at least half the time of the day. So how do we make that active? And this is something that helps us track that. And because we can do this computationally, we don't need to look at it in every one of the items. Or if something changes or people buy something and that changes into commercial, it automatically pops up.
May I ask whether the students have any question for Subharti, because we are approaching the end of the lecture as well as also the module time. So I would like to know whether Master Year 2 have any specific question before going to a question which has been sent via the chat. Okay, we do this way, of course. If there is a question, guys, just unmute yourself and ask. So no need for me to coordinate that much.
Yeah, I think if you just ask me the question instead of the chat, I can't.
Yeah, exactly. Lei, would you mind unmuting and yeah.
Yes, just a question about the.
Can you be a little louder, please?
I'm sorry, can you hear my voice?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, just I assume that there would be a huge gap between bioenergy-driven structure and a human cognition-based structure. So my question is that if there is any test or simulation on the transport efficiency based on your master plan, I mean the one adopted the system of slime modes.
Sorry, I couldn't answer. Davide, did you understand the question? Are you able to?
Can you read my question in the chat window?
Okay, let me try and Lei, right?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, Lei, you're saying that a question about the Li Shui case, as a master plan adopted in a complex system model of slime molds, is there a test or simulation on this aspect of transport efficiency? I assume, yes, there is. Lei, the best one to look at it, I mean, it's the other way around. We looked at the transport system of Tokyo as an efficient model. And if you look at the Tokyo underground metro system and their network hierarchy, and then that has often been, it wasn't one from the slime mold we moved to practicality, it was the other way around. We looked at Tokyo and that kind of reflected a similar strategy as the slime mold in the research someone had done. And then we took from there and moved back again. So it was the other way around. We looked at the system, which was the Tokyo Metro, which was quite efficient. That reflected something in the organic spectrum that we could find was efficient as well. And therefore we moved back. So it wasn't the other way around. We didn't start from the slime mold. We actually started from the Tokyo Metro. Does that answer your question?
I would like to have one more question, because as you just showed the master plan of Li Shui, and if my understanding is correctly, I think the plan is super complicated. And I'm just wondering if this would cause any trouble in human cognition when they are trying to find their way by vehicle.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's a good question. And no, the answer is no, it won't, because you see, and that's what we were explaining with Richard, is that if you look at London plan, it's very complicated, but you don't find yourself lost because you move from icons to another icon, recognizable buildings. In fact, if I took out the street names from Manhattan, near 23rd Street and 2nd or something like that, then you'll be more lost because you can't relate where you're going to. So you don't know if you're going towards that church or that cathedral. So at an urban perspective, when you look at it from a bird's eye view, it might look very complicated, but on ground, you actually would be more familiar because you're always meeting icons. And that's the critical bit. Even though if the icons are not very pretty, if it's the ugliest building, you will still remember it because you're always meeting head on. So the answer is yes, it is complicated from an overall perspective, but actually if you go in. And I would recommend that if you, the best way you can experience this is, if you visit organic developments, any organic development, it could be slums that have grown over time or cities that have grown over time. If you go in there, you would see that the spaces seem more familiar than in cities, because in cities, in orthogonal cities specifically, or the grid system, let's say, which you see on this right-hand side here, they are more anonymous than this. So that's the conclusion of the research, is that you tend to recognize more yourself in cities like London than in cities like, let's say, a very good grid city is cities like Chandigarh. You can't recognize most streets apart from that capital complex, because it is so monotonous and so controlled. So that is the difference between architecture and urban planning. And I think, as architects, we want to be really, having a really nice, pretty urban plan with straight lines, but it doesn't necessarily work in urban planning.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the conclusion I can say of the research so far. Yeah.
Perfect. So if there is one last question from the students.
Something about Paris.
Sorry? Subarti?
What can old cities, sorry, I'm trying to read the text. What can old cities learn from new cities, Dubai and vice versa?
From was a question from City. Yeah, I missed that one.
Yeah, so, or if there's any other question, I can answer that.
No, it seems there are no questions from the students. So we close with the last question from City.
Okay, so what can old new cities learn from old cities? I think they can learn a lot about the scales that work. Dubai being so many high-rise towers, so many high-rise, but there is only a recognizable few that people feel as a destination, and surprisingly enough, a good approach is to look at social media of people, which is quite interesting, because every time I look at someone posting someone in social media in Dubai, I don't have a clue where they are, because it could be anywhere in Dubai. And whereas if you see someone posting a social media in Rome, you can point out where this place is if you've been there, is because you know that every square in Rome has this different kind of sculpture or a different fountain or a particular church facing that square and so on, which creates that mental identity and which translates also visually. Because we are, as human beings, we are very visual, and therefore these things help a lot. So that is something that Dubai can learn from Paris or even Rome.
Yeah, but Subati, I think it's also a matter of time, because we all know that Rome has actually 2,000 years of history in architecture, while Dubai has been built in the last 40 years, let's say, no? So of course there are a lot of buildings, not of icons and squares and marks that you can recognize everywhere.
Well, I mean, you say that, David, but we have built more buildings in this century than ever before. So
true, but many of them are. I mean, if we talk about Dubai, many of the buildings over there, except for the Burj Khalifa, or so, are just buildings, are anonymous buildings. They have no. You cannot compare, as you said, now with a specific, let's say, church in a square of Rome, which is known for historical reasons too. So there is an heritage over there. So the two things have a different soul. Okay, there is one. No, there are a couple of questions now from students.
Okay,
So Jean first. How do you determine each node for your mesh system? What kind of factors or parameters do you play with to identify the place as a distributed center for a city?
Yeah.
And
so
I can answer, and before you go there, I can answer one question. Can you share the PPT with us? Yes, Subhati will send the PPT to me and I will upload on the learning mode. That was a technical question.
Okay. So the node, yes, there was logics to it. So when we were doing the research, we knew that there were going to be certain distribution required. But when we actually went into practicality, I mean, currently we distributed it based on the requirements of the client. So there are many parameters, some of which I can disclose, some of it I can't, but mainly, let's say distance is a critical parameter, activity status is a critical parameter, revenue generation is a parameter. So there are many parameters, and then when you have these parameters, we have to prioritize one over the other, and depending on which parameters, so depending on which parameter we choose, it highlights that position. So for example, on this side of the screen, you can see that the specific points we picked in terms of culture, industry. This was done in a research in a part of Beijing. And then even after we select the parameter, we go through a fitness criteria. So not necessarily if the parameters meet, the node is identified, then we have to further undergo fitness of that node to see if back again. So it's like a 2-3 back and forth steps to see if the original efficiency module is still maintained after these fitness criteria are met. So yeah, and then we decide on the final one. So it's a bit of a complex system. Yeah. So I know it doesn't give you all the answers what I said, but yeah. And then there are multiple points in the middle. It has to talk about distances and so on and so forth. So yeah, there are quite a few fitness systems. It's very, yeah, it takes a long time to answer this.
Can you, Subharti, before seriously reading, just one last question. Can you go back one slide?
Yeah.
The previous one you were showing. No, because maybe one farther then. No. No, I was just, anyway, there were, hold on, okay, so it's number 57. Yep. I was just using this when you were discussing this slide. You used also this example to explain that yes, there are tests that gets run in order to validate basically your design decisions. And I just wanted to use this example to link to what we were discussing with the students both earlier today as well as in the last days. Now, when there is a design proposal, there is the need to check that the proposal is actually working properly, and it goes via a number of steps till refining it and find the possibly the best solution. So it's not just a one shot and hopefully it will work. It's a process, is a loop, let's say.
Yeah, one can differ from location to location as well, which one works and which one doesn't.
Last question is from Mingyan that writes, do you think the triangle pattern of traffic system can have the potential of solving Brest paradox?
So Davide, help me out. What is Brest paradox?
I have to ask Mingyan to turn on the camera and clarify what the Brest paradox is.
Yes.
Yes.
Actually, that was something that, because recently we are trying to apply the traffic network to our urban model, and that is actually one theory that we found about the traffic efficiency. It said that sometimes, not sometimes, it's like we normally are trying to applying or raise the traffic efficiency by adding more roads, but sometimes sometimes if we are adding a shortcut, it will it will not just not raise the efficiency, but decrease the efficiency of the whole traffic system. And at that specific shortcut, it will also cause some traffic jam, because that people because of that shortcut will ideally decrease the time of travel, and the people are all coming into that road, and that road just normally will take a lot of density, and and it just
I'm
No,
just
I think
yeah.
you know, when you say traffic, I think in your mind you're only talking about cars. Yes, and I think that's a block in itself. If you free your mind from cars, you know, you would see a bigger city. You know, think of a city bigger. I know what you mean exactly. That people, if you provide people a shortcut, they will take the shortcut. If you're driving, yes, but you can always change the priority of the road. You can pedestrianize a road. You can, and that is something you can do when the road is 16 meters. When the road is 16 meters, you can play with it in so many different ways and reconstruct it, that you can, I mean, I can tell you the road I was living 4 months ago, overnight, it was changed from a trafficked road to a road which can only be used for cyclists. So you can stop that with urban efficiency modules, but I would suggest or recommend that when you're talking about traffic, please, you know, if you think only in the logic of cars, it is a very big urban problem, because you know, cars are not people. It is the biggest isolation parameter in a city. You sit inside your car, you close your window, and you turn on your air conditioning. You close the city to you, and which means that you have closed all the benefits of interaction and everything else in the city, which public transport can provide, walking can provide, cycling can provide, and other forms of transport can provide. If you want to go from A to B in the quickest way possible, still it's not the car. It is a public transport, which is the train or a high-speed train or something. So, I mean, I've been trying to fight a lot about getting people who are students to kind of think beyond the car and beyond the traffic of the car, because if the cars are stuck in a jam, you know, it must be frustrating. So next time people will take alternate modes and actually benefit from what the city has to offer. So I don't think it's bad. And you can always close roads. So if you get the overall idea, you know. So I mean, that's
quite, I mean, that's quite inspiring to me, because not only that we are asking about the traffic and also the, you know, the traffic system, we are normally just go into the finding about the personal vehicle and also the cars, and but yeah, this is a very good new perspective for me, actually.
Well, I'm glad you understand it. I mean, I have been trying to convince many governments to understand, but their transport department doesn't want to talk to the land department, and so on and so forth. And there's politics involved, obviously, but it's a very difficult challenge. But I hope whatever you're doing, and when you get it, and you can use this perspective to enhance the quality of the city. And I'm sure, you know, I don't know. I don't know. I can't convince. He's asking me to convince the Malaysian government. I don't know. But
there are also different reasons, because
I think
there is a car industry, you know.
Yeah, there's a car industry. There's all other industries, and
if you think,
and somehow we need to make it beneficial for everyone as well, and for the city to work economically as well. So I think it takes more than a lifetime to make small changes in the practicality on ground in the city. But the research must not stop. The ideas must keep flowing, and because that is easier to float within a lifetime. So
Well,
yeah, keep going.
yeah, this is what I was also thinking while you were discussing with Isa the say blockchain and city application. I think it will happen, and even massively, but for sure it will take more than a lifetime, because also cities and architecture very slow in accepting changes, by the way. So it's a pretty reluctant and slow field, this one. Anyway, I think we are way beyond our normal times, and Subhash has been very kind to stay with us for the whole time. So it's more than 1 hour and a half. So thank you very much for being with us, for granting your time, your experience, and your lecture. I also want to thank you, the students, for the questions, as well as the staff who have been attending. Technical information, of course, for my students. I'm going to upload tomorrow this on the learning mode, the recording, as well as then the PDF from Subhash, which of course will redact all the things that cannot be shared for professional reasons, of course. And with this in mind, I wish all of you here in China a nice afternoon and dinner probably. And by the way, the best way to move in China is the e-bike, is not even the bus. So that's definitely the fastest way to go from A to B. And I wish Subhash a nice day in London. Okay. So thank you very much for being with us, and see you guys, to my students, on Thursday afternoon. Thanks, Subhash. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for having me.
We stay in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye.